You wake up one morning and realize you can't remember the last time you felt something real. The alarm goes off. You shower. You dress. You commute. You perform. You return. You sleep. And somewhere in that loop, you disappeared. You're 38 years old, standing in your kitchen with expensive coffee you don't taste, wearing clothes that cost more than your first car, living in an apartment that looks like it belongs to someone else. Maybe it's the success that brought no satisfaction. Maybe it's the efficiency that somehow drained all the color from your days. Or maybe it's just the terrible silence underneath all your accomplishments, the gnawing sense that you've won a game that doesn't matter. And without warning, something fundamental cracks open in your chest. I've done everything right, so why does it feel so wrong? Max Weber predicted this psychological catastrophe. He watched modernity being constructed like an iron cage around the human soul, and he documented with chilling precision what happens to people who get crushed between the gears of rationalization. He identified traits, patterns, psychological scars that mark those who've been broken by the very world that promised to liberate them. These aren't obvious wounds. They're invisible fractures in how you see reality, how you measure worth, how you justify your own existence. And if you're reading this feeling that cold recognition in your gut, you're not alone. You're experiencing what Weber called the disenchantment of the world, and it's rewriting your psychology in ways you haven't even noticed yet. Today, I'm going to reveal the 5 hidden traits of people crushed by the modern world according to Max Weber's sociology. Not the surface symptoms everyone talks about, burnout or anxiety or depression, but the deeper structural changes in consciousness that happen when you spend too long living in what Weber called the iron cage of rationality. As you listen, ask yourself which of these invisible scars you recognize in yourself, because recognition is the first step toward something Weber believed was nearly impossible in modernity: re-enchantment. Trait 1, the tyranny of calculability. You cannot experience anything without measuring it. When Weber analyzed the rise of modern capitalism, he identified something he called formal rationality, the systematic calculation of means and ends that comes to dominate every sphere of life. In traditional societies, people acted based on tradition, emotion, values, things that couldn't be quantified. But modernity demands calculation. Everything must be measured, optimized, made efficient. And if you've been crushed by this world, that calculating mindset has colonized your entire consciousness. You can't go for a walk without tracking your steps. You can't read a book without wondering if it's the most valuable use of your time. You can't have a conversation without unconsciously assessing its networking potential. You can't even rest without feeling like you're falling behind in some invisible competition. This isn't productivity. It's pathology. Weber would say your psyche has internalized the logic of capitalism so completely that you've become a calculation machine. You don't have experiences anymore. You have metrics. You don't have relationships. You have contacts. You don't have a life. You have a portfolio of optimized activities that generate measurable outputs. The tragedy Weber identified is that this calculating rationality, this obsession with efficiency and measurement, actually makes you less capable of experiencing the things that make life meaningful. Love cannot be optimized. Beauty cannot be quantified. Meaning cannot be calculated. But if your consciousness has been trained to only value what can be measured, you become psychologically incapable of appreciating anything that transcends measurement. You're standing in front of a sunset checking your phone. You're at dinner with someone you love mentally reviewing your to-do list. You're achieving everything and experiencing nothing because you've lost the capacity for what Weber called substantive rationality, the ability to act based on ultimate values rather than calculated self-interest. This is the first hidden trait. You've become so rational that you've rationalized away your own humanity. Modern research on what psychologists call the quantified self movement validates Weber's concerns. Studies show that people who obsessively track their behaviors, sleep, exercise, productivity, report lower life satisfaction and higher anxiety, despite improved metrics. They're optimizing themselves into psychological poverty. Because when everything becomes data, nothing remains sacred. When every moment must justify itself through measurable productivity, you lose access to the experiences that actually make existence worthwhile, the moments of play, spontaneity, Wonder, connection that cannot be captured in spreadsheets or translated into career advancement. If you recognize this trait in yourself, if you find yourself unable to simply be without calculating the return on investment of your being, you're not broken. You're colonized. Your consciousness has been occupied by the logic of a system that Weber warned would trap us all. Trait 2. The Protestant work ethic internalized as identity. You cannot separate your worth from your productivity. This is perhaps Weber's most famous insight. In his masterwork, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber traced how Calvinist theology, the belief that worldly success might indicate divine election, created a new type of human being. Someone who works compulsively not because they need to, but because work itself becomes proof of moral worth. The Calvinists believed that God had already decided who was saved and who was damned, and that hard work and financial success might be signs of being among the elect. This created what Weber called an inner-worldly asceticism. Instead of withdrawing from the world to find God, you throw yourself into worldly activity with religious intensity. You work not for pleasure or even for profit, but to prove your value to a God who may have already condemned you. Now here's what Weber found terrifying. That religious framework died, but the psychological structure it created survived and intensified. We no longer believe in Calvinist predestination, but we've internalized the work ethic it produced. We've kept the compulsion to work without the theological justification. We're running on a treadmill installed by a religion we don't even believe in anymore. If you've been crushed by modernity, you experience your own worth as directly proportional to your productivity. A day where you didn't accomplish anything feels like moral failure. Vacation creates guilt rather than rest. Retirement seems like death because without work, who even are you? You've confused activity with virtue, busyness with righteousness, achievement with salvation. And the cruel irony Weber identified is that this produces endless striving without satisfaction. Because if your worth depends on productivity, you can never produce enough. There's always more to do, always another goal, always someone more successful to compare yourself against. You're trapped in what Weber called the iron cage, a prison built not by external force, but by your own internalized compulsion to prove your value through ceaseless work. Contemporary research on workaholism shows exactly what Weber predicted. People who derive their primary identity from work report higher rates of depression, relationship failure, and existential emptiness, despite often achieving external success. They're running a race with no finish line because the race itself has become their reason for existing. They cannot rest because rest feels like regression. They cannot enjoy because enjoyment seems frivolous compared to achievement. They've sacrificed presence for productivity, and discovered too late that productivity without presence is just expensive emptiness. If this is you, if you feel guilty for existing unless you're producing something, you're carrying a psychological burden installed by a theological system that died a century ago, but left its ghost in your nervous system. You're not lazy for wanting rest. You're not weak for questioning whether endless work actually produces a meaningful life. You're waking up from a trance that Weber documented as the defining pathology of modern consciousness. Share in the comments if you recognize this. Write, I can't separate my worth from my work. Because when you name it, when you see that this isn't your personal failing but a collective psychological structure, you take the first step toward freedom. You realize you're not broken. You're responding exactly as modernity trained you to respond. And that means you can learn a different response. Trait 3. Disenchantment as default perception. You've lost the capacity to experience wonder. Weber's concept of disenchantment, the Entzauberung der Welt, the disenchantment of the world, describes what happens when rationalization strips reality of its magical qualities. In pre-modern societies, the world was alive with meaning. Storms were God speaking. Illness was spiritual imbalance. Success was divine favor. Everything had deeper significance beyond its material properties. But modernity, through science, bureaucracy, and instrumental rationality, explained away the magic. Storms became atmospheric pressure systems. Illness became biological malfunction. Success became the result of calculated effort and market forces. We traded enchantment for explanation, mystery for mastery, meaning for mechanism, and Weber warned that this trade would hollow us out psychologically. If you've been crushed by the modern world, you experience reality as fundamentally empty of intrinsic meaning. You look at a mountain and see geological formations. You look at a person and see biological processes and social conditioning. You look at your own life and see a series of contingent events with no deeper purpose. Everything can be explained, and because everything can be explained, nothing feels significant. You've developed what Weber would call an intellectualist approach to existence. You understand everything and experience nothing. You can describe the neurochemical basis of love, but you can't feel it fully. You know the evolutionary purpose of awe, but you rarely encounter it. You've become a spectator of your own life, analyzing rather than inhabiting, explaining rather than experiencing. The world has become, in Weber's haunting phrase, a mechanism devoid of meaning, and you've internalized that mechanistic view so deeply that you've mechanized your own inner life. This creates a specific kind of suffering that Weber identified as uniquely modern. It's not the suffering of tragedy or loss or injustice experiences that at least carry dramatic weight. It's the suffering of meaninglessness, the quiet desperation of existing in a world that offers comfort and explanation, but no transcendent purpose. You have everything you need, and nothing that matters. You're comfortable and empty, safe and suffocated, successful by every external measure and spiritually bankrupt. Because disenchantment doesn't just remove the gods from the sky, it removes the possibility of experiencing anything as sacred, including yourself. When nothing is holy, everything is hollow. When all mystery has been explained away, existence becomes an explained-away mystery that offers no foothold for meaning. Research on what psychologists call meaning crisis validates Weber's diagnosis. Studies show that people in highly rationalized, scientifically advanced societies report lower levels of meaning and purpose despite higher material prosperity. The very tools we created to master nature, science, technology, bureaucratic organization, have created a world we can control but cannot love, a world we can explain but cannot revere. If you feel this, if you look at reality and feel nothing, if beauty leaves you unmoved and accomplishment feels arbitrary, you're not depressed in the clinical sense. You're experiencing the psychological consequence of living in a disenchanted world. And Weber's terrifying insight was that this might be irreversible. Once you've seen behind the curtain, once rationalization has explained the magic trick, you cannot unsee it. You cannot choose to believe in enchantment. And yet without enchantment, without the sense that something matters beyond calculation and explanation, human beings cannot thrive psychologically. Trait 4. Bureaucratic consciousness in personal life. You've started treating yourself like an organization to be managed. Weber's analysis of bureaucracy revealed how modernity creates new forms of domination through impersonal rules and procedures. Bureaucracy is rational legal authority, power justified not by tradition or charisma but by following established procedures. It's efficient, predictable, and utterly dehumanizing. You're not a person in a bureaucracy. You're a case, a file, a number to be processed according to rules that apply to everyone equally and care about no one individually. What Weber didn't fully anticipate was how deeply we would internalize bureaucratic logic and apply it to ourselves. If you've been crushed by modernity, you don't just work in bureaucratic systems. You've become a bureaucratic system. You manage yourself through policies and procedures. You have personal mission statements, strategic plans, quarterly reviews of your own life. You treat your body like a machine requiring maintenance protocols. You treat your emotions like problems requiring management interventions. You treat your relationships like projects requiring clear objectives and measurable outcomes. This seems responsible on the surface, but Weber would recognize it as the colonization of the life world by systems logic. You've imported the instrumental rationality of organizational management into the intimate sphere of personal existence, and in doing so, you've objectified yourself. You're both the manager and the managed, the administrator and the administered. You wake up and review your systems. Morning routine, optimized. Nutrition protocol, implemented. Exercise regimen, executed. Emotional check-in, documented. Social obligations, scheduled. Personal development, tracked. Everything runs smoothly, efficiently, according to plan. And somewhere in all that management, The actual person you're supposed to be managing has disappeared. Because you cannot bureaucratize your way to being human. You cannot procedure yourself into authenticity. You cannot policy yourself into presence. Weber observed that bureaucracy, while efficient, strips away individual discretion and spontaneity. Everything must follow the rules. Nothing can be exceptional. The same logic applies when you bureaucratize yourself. You lose the capacity for spontaneity, for responding to the moment, for allowing yourself to be moved by something that doesn't fit your strategic plan. You become rigid, scheduled, optimized for efficiency, and utterly incapable of the kind of alive responsiveness that makes existence feel real. You've confused self-discipline with self-management, and in the process you've turned yourself into an organization that runs smoothly, but feels nothing. Contemporary psychology has identified this pattern in what researchers call emotional labor directed at the self. People spend enormous energy managing their own emotions, monitoring their thoughts, regulating their behaviors according to internalized productivity standards. They're CEOs of their own lives, and like many CEOs, they're making rational decisions that destroy the soul of the enterprise they're managing. If you recognize this, if you've created elaborate systems to manage yourself and found that the more efficiently you run your life, the less you actually experience it, you're living out Weber's nightmare. You've become what he called the specialist without spirit, someone who executes procedures brilliantly while forgetting what those procedures were supposed to serve. Your life runs like a well-oiled machine, and you're the machine. Trait 5. The legitimation crisis of your own existence. You cannot justify why you should exist beyond your function. This is perhaps the darkest trait Weber's analysis predicts. In traditional societies, existence itself had inherent meaning. You existed because God created you, because you were part of a cosmic order, because your place in the community was given by tradition. But modernity destroys all those legitimations. Weber called this the rationalization of authority. Power must now justify itself through effectiveness, not through divine right or sacred tradition. The same logic extends to individual existence. You cannot simply exist anymore. Your existence must be legitimated, justified through utility, through contribution, through measurable value added to society. If you've been crushed by the modern world, you've internalized this demand for legitimation so completely that you experience your own existence as something that requires constant justification. You wake up needing to prove you deserve to be alive, not explicitly, not consciously, but in the background, always running, is the question: what have I done today that justifies the resources I consume, the space I occupy, the attention I receive? Your worth is not inherent. It's contingent on your productivity, your usefulness, your ability to contribute something that someone else values. This creates what Weber would recognize as a permanent legitimation crisis. You can never produce enough evidence that your existence is justified. There's always someone more productive, more successful, more valuable. You're always on trial for the crime of existing, and the verdict is always insufficient justification, try harder, produce more, be better. The cruelty of this structure is that it's invisible. You don't realize you're constantly defending your right to exist. It feels like normal ambition, healthy drive, reasonable self-improvement. But underneath is the terror that if you stop producing, stop achieving, stop adding value, you'll be revealed as fundamentally worthless. Weber documented how capitalism requires human beings to function as productive units within rational systems. Your value is your economic contribution. Your significance is your market utility. And because most of us aren't in positions where our work feels inherently meaningful, we experience ourselves as interchangeable parts in machines we don't control, serving purposes we don't choose, for reasons we can't quite articulate. We work because we must work to survive. We justify our survival through our work. And the circle closes into a trap with no exit. This is what Weber meant by the iron cage. It's not external imprisonment. It's the internalization of market logic so complete that you cannot imagine measuring human worth through any other metric than productive output. You've lost access to the idea that existence itself might be valuable, that being might matter independently of doing, that you might deserve to live simply because you are alive. Modern research on what psychologists call productivity guilt and imposter syndrome reveals exactly this pattern. High-achieving individuals report persistent feelings that they're frauds, that their success is undeserved, that they'll be exposed as worthless if they don't keep performing. They cannot internalize their achievements because achievement is never enough. The standard keeps rising because the standard isn't really about what you've done. It's about whether you deserve to exist, and that question has no satisfactory answer within the framework of instrumental rationality. If this resonates, if you feel like you're always one failure away from being exposed as fundamentally insufficient, you're experiencing the legitimation crisis Weber predicted. You're trying to justify your existence through productivity in a system where no amount of productivity can ever grant you inherent worth. You're running a race that has no finish line because the race itself is a distraction from the real question: do I have value simply for existing? And modernity has trained you to answer, no. Not unless I earn it. Not unless I prove it. Not unless I produce something that justifies the space I take up. Because Weber understood these traits as interconnected symptoms of rationalization. Therefore, he saw them not as individual pathologies but as collective psychological consequences of living in the iron cage. The calculating mindset, the Protestant work ethic, the disenchantment, the bureaucratic self-management, the legitimation crisis, they're all manifestations of the same underlying transformation. Modernity has systematically stripped away all the traditional sources of meaning, community, tradition, religion, shared values, and replaced them with instrumental rationality. We're more free than any humans in history to choose our own paths. And we're more lost than any humans in history because we have no shared map that makes any particular path meaningful. This is what Weber called the polar night of icy darkness. We've organized ourselves into the most rational, efficient, productive civilization ever created. And in the process, we've created a world that's psychologically uninhabitable for the human beings who must live in it. We've optimized everything except what makes existence worthwhile. We've explained everything except how to find meaning once all the explanations are complete. We've liberated ourselves from every traditional constraint and discovered that freedom without purpose is just sophisticated emptiness. Weber believed this was the defining tragedy of modernity. We cannot go back to pre-modern enchantment. We cannot unlearn what rationalization has taught us. We cannot choose to believe in gods we've thoroughly explained away, or find meaning in traditions we've completely demystified. But we also cannot thrive psychologically in the disenchanted world we've created. We're trapped between a past we cannot return to and a future that offers progress without purpose. So what do? How do we live in the iron cage without being crushed by it? Weber himself offered no easy answers. He wasn't optimistic about mass re-enchantment. He didn't believe we could collectively recover meaning in a fundamentally meaningless world. But he did identify possibilities at the individual level, what he called value-rational action, living according to ultimate values you choose to commit to, not because they're objectively true or rationally justified, but because you decide they're worth dedicating your life toward. This isn't faith in the traditional sense. It's what Weber called polytheism of values. Choosing your gods in a world where the gods are dead. Committing to purposes you know are subjective but treating them as if they're sacred anyway. For Weber, this meant intellectual honesty about the predicament we're in combined with passionate commitment to values that cannot be rationally proven. It meant acknowledging that meaning is constructed, not discovered, and choosing to construct it anyway. It meant understanding that you live in the iron cage while refusing to let the cage define the entirety of your existence. It meant creating pockets of enchantment within disenchantment, moments where you choose to experience something as sacred, even though you know the scientific explanation, standing in front of art and letting it move you without analyzing why, loving someone fully without calculating the relationship's utility, committing to work that matters to you even if it doesn't optimize your market value. These aren't escapes from the iron cage. They're conscious decisions to live partially outside its logic while remaining inside its structure. Weber also emphasized what he called the ethic of responsibility versus the ethic of conviction. You can be purely conviction-driven, believing so absolutely in your values that you ignore consequences. Or you can be purely responsibility-driven, calculating outcomes without reference to values. Weber argued that mature existence in modernity requires holding both in tension, committing to values while acknowledging consequences, acting with conviction while remaining aware of costs. This is difficult. It requires living with contradictions that cannot be resolved. But Weber believed it was the only path that preserved both rationality and meaning. You don't abandon calculation entirely. You don't pretend the world is re-enchanted. But you also don't surrender your entire consciousness to instrumental logic. You choose when to calculate and when to simply experience. You create boundaries around the calculating mindset instead of letting it colonize everything. Contemporary thinkers who've built on Weber suggest practices for navigating this tension. Philosopher Charles Taylor talks about finding fullness in a secular age, moments where existence feels genuinely meaningful, despite intellectual knowledge of its constructed nature. Psychologist William James, whom Weber read carefully, advocated for the will to believe, choosing to act as if certain unprovable things are true because doing so makes life livable. Sociologist Hartmut Rosa builds on Weber to suggest resonance as an alternative to acceleration, cultivating relationships with the world that vibrate with meaning rather than just extracting utility. These aren't solutions. They're strategies for living consciously within a structure that Weber correctly identified as fundamentally inhuman. They're ways of acknowledging the iron cage while refusing to let it completely define you. But there's something Weber documented that might be the most important insight of all. The people who survive the iron cage without being crushed are those who understand what it is. The ones who see the structure clearly, who recognize how rationalization works, who name the mechanisms that colonize consciousness. Because once you see it, you can resist it, not escape it, not transcend it, but create conscious distance from it. When you catch yourself calculating the return on investment of a friendship, you can notice that thought and choose differently. When you feel your worth collapsing because you weren't productive today, you can recognize that as internalized market logic and reject it. When you experience the world as meaningless mechanism, you can identify that as disenchantment rather than truth. This is what Weber meant by disenchantment of disenchantment. Using rationality to understand the limits of rationality. Seeing how the iron cage was built so you can find the gaps in its bars. The 5 traits we've explored, the tyranny of calculability, Protestant work ethic as identity, disenchantment as default, bureaucratic self-management, existential legitimation crisis. They're not permanent psychological damage. They're learned responses to living in rationalized modernity. And what's learned can be unlearned, or at least seen clearly enough that you have choice about whether to keep performing these patterns. You cannot change the world that produced these traits. Weber was right that rationalization is irreversible at the societal level. But you can change your relationship to that world. You can refuse to internalize its logic completely. You can create protected spaces where different values operate. You can choose consciously and deliberately what to calculate and what to experience without calculation. This is what Weber would recognize as individuation within the iron cage. Not escape, not transcendence, but conscious inhabitation. Living in modernity while maintaining enough critical distance that it doesn't colonize your entire consciousness. It's difficult. It requires constant vigilance against the psychological currents that want to reduce you to a productive unit. But it's possible. And it might be the only meaningful rebellion available to those of us born into the iron cage. We cannot smash the cage, but we can refuse to become the cage. We can remain human inside the machinery. We can experience moments of genuine presence even inside systems designed to extract productivity. We can love, create, wonder, and commit to values that have no rational justification, but make existence feel like more than just optimized emptiness. If you've recognized yourself in these 5 traits, you're not broken. You're responding exactly as Weber predicted people would respond to living in rationalized modernity. The calculating mindset, the work as identity, the inability to feel wonder, the self-bureaucratization, the constant need to justify your existence, these aren't personal failings. They're sociological patterns. They're the psychological cost of living in the most rational and least enchanted civilization humanity has ever created. And recognizing them is the first step toward something Weber thought was rare, but possible. Conscious life within the iron cage. You see the bars clearly. And in seeing them, you find the spaces between them where you can still breathe, still choose, still experience something that transcends mere calculation. Weber once wrote, "The fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, by the disenchantment of the world." He saw this as tragic and irreversible, but he also believed that individuals could choose how to respond to that tragedy. You can surrender completely to instrumental rationality, becoming nothing but a productive unit. Or you can live consciously in tension, using rationality when it serves you while refusing to let it define you entirely. The choice isn't between enchantment and disenchantment. That choice was made by history. The choice is between unconscious submission to the iron cage or conscious resistance from within it, between letting modernity crush you completely or finding ways to remain human despite its crushing pressure. So here's what I want you to understand. If you feel crushed by the modern world, if you recognize these 5 traits in yourself, you're not experiencing personal pathology. You're experiencing structural pressure. The weight you feel isn't your weakness. It's the iron cage pressing down on consciousness that was never designed to live this way. Humans evolved for enchanted worlds, for communities bound by tradition, for lives that had inherent, rather than constructed meaning. And now we're trying to exist psychologically in a world that's efficient, rational, and utterly indifferent to whether our existence feels meaningful. The fact that you feel crushed proves you're still human. The calculation machines don't feel the pressure. They just optimize. If you're in pain, it's because part of you is still resisting, still insisting that there must be more to existence than productivity and explanation. That resistance is sacred. That refusal to accept complete disenchantment is the only thing Weber thought might preserve human dignity and modernity. Don't let anyone convince you the pressure you feel is your fault. Don't accept the narrative that if you just optimized better, calculated smarter, worked harder, you'd finally feel okay. That's the iron cage speaking, trying to convince you that total surrender is the solution to the suffering it creates. The suffering isn't evidence you're doing it wrong. It's evidence you haven't completely surrendered your humanity to the machinery. Keep that resistance alive. Learn to recognize when you're thinking like a calculation machine and choose sometimes to think like a human being instead. Create moments where you allow yourself to experience without measuring, to be without producing, to exist without justifying. This is how you survive the iron cage without being crushed by it. Not through escape, because there is no escape. Not through surrender, because surrender is spiritual death. But through conscious inhabitation. Seeing clearly what modernity does to consciousness while refusing to let it do all of it. You live in the world Weber described. But you don't have to become the person that world wants you to be. You can be something else. Something that calculates when necessary but also dreams. Something that works, but also plays. Something that understands disenchantment but occasionally experiences wonder anyway. Something that exists in the iron cage while keeping alive the memory that humans were meant for more than this. And maybe, just maybe, by living that way, by refusing complete colonization, you become part of what Weber could only hope for but never quite believed in. Small acts of re-enchantment, not grand solutions or societal transformation. Just individual moments where someone chooses meaning over mechanism, presence over productivity, being over calculating. It's not much. Weber would be the first to admit it's not enough to change the fundamental structure, but it might be enough to keep you human. And in the iron cage, staying human might be the most radical thing you can do. If this resonated with you, if you recognize the crushing weight of rationalized modernity in your own life, I want you to know you're not alone in this. There's a community of people waking up to these patterns, seeing the cage clearly, and learning to breathe inside it. Subscribe to this channel because we're going deeper into Weber's insights about how modernity reshapes consciousness and what we can do about it. Every video is another tool for seeing clearly, for understanding the forces that want to reduce you to a productive unit, and for finding ways to remain fully human despite them. And if you want to go even deeper into Weber's analysis of the iron cage and the specific mechanisms that trap modern consciousness, watch my next video where I reveal Weber's most dangerous discovery about the one psychological trait that either destroys you or sets you free in rationalized modernity. It's the pattern Weber documented in his own life, the realization that changed how he understood freedom itself. You need to see this. Thank you for being here, for questioning, for refusing to accept that optimization is the same as living. Keep seeing clearly. I'll see you in the next awakening.